Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second part of the introductory lecture for um, contemporary documentary media. This is the lecture for week one, which I have entitled On the Contemporary Beyond Observation. And we could add to that On the New Documentary. For this week, I have asked that you watch Ross Malkowie's 1986 film Sherman's March, a meditation on the possibility of romantic love in the South during an era of nuclear proliferation. And I have requested that you read Linda Williams's essay Mirrors Without Memories, Truth, History, and the New Documentary. There was also a recommended reading by Michael Renoff entitled First Person Films, Some Theses on Self-Inscription. This lecture is composed of about 4 parts. The first pertaining to this notion of the new documentary, so roughly documentary post-1980. The second pertains to the concept or notion of the contemporary, which we'll discuss a little bit and develop throughout the course. The third is a discussion of Malkowie's film, Sherman's March, and finally we'll conclude with some questions and discussion topics that you may want to take up either in the synchronous group discussion that we will be holding on Thursday or the online discussion on Canvas. Now, considering the question of the new documentary, we're going to be thinking about how there was what we consider to be a turn in the 1980s pertaining to a transformation, broadly speaking, in the documentary project. One of the leading lights of this new documentary turn is the American filmmaker Errol Morris, who I'm sure many of you already know, and we'll be looking at a number of his works throughout the course. Now, in 1982, on the David Letterman show, talk show, Errol Morris was invited on to discuss his recently released film, Gates of Heaven, which was a documentary portrait of people who own and operate pet cemeteries. And I would just like for us to hear just a little bit of what Errol Morris says in his description of what he considers to be the new documentary. Here's Errol Morris.
Pet owners. How does your style of documentary filmmaking differ from other people?
Well, I think you can see, just looking at the clip, that there's been no attempt. A lot of documentary films made today, people have handheld cameras, they scurry around, they try to hide, they try to remain as inobtrusive as possible. In this kind of filmmaking, we stare down the subject, almost like a big game hunter. There's no attempt made to hide at all. In fact, the camera is put on a tripod and they speak directly to the camera. So
Are people receptive to that? Does it take them a while to warm up to that notion?
I think they love it. It gives them an opportunity to perform.
Do these people feel that they're being made fun of or made light of?
Everybody in the film has had an opportunity to see themselves, and they all like themselves in the film, and they all like the film as well.
So it's pretty much a direct representation of what they would be talking about or saying in their own living room or with their friends or whatever, huh?
More or less.
Yeah. All right.
Among the things of interest that Morris brings up in this brief clip is this notion that as a culture, historically and socially, we're becoming increasingly a kind of people of the camera. That is to say, the culture of the image is such that we're recognizing that it is a part of our lives from birth. It is a part of our environment. It even perhaps structures our existence and mediates both our social relationships as well as even our sense of ourselves. This is partly the sense of which Linda Williams discusses the notion of the mirror with memory or the mirror without memory. Okay. Now, in her essay, Mirrors Without Memories, Truth, History, and the New Documentary, Linda Williams relates this question of the new documentary and its relationship to the social, the historical, the personal, and so on, to the well-established concept of postmodernism. Now, we won't be dealing with postmodernism in great detail, but I think it is useful for us to turn to it and develop it a little bit before we move on to the question of the new documentary more specifically. In Linda Williams cites the great Marxist cultural theorist Frederick Jameson and his notion of what he calls the cultural logic of postmodernism, in which he describes what he calls a new depthlessness which finds its prolongation both in contemporary theory and in a whole new culture of the image or the simulacrum. Now, Jameson wrote about this in the early 1980s. And Williams goes on, to Jameson, the effect of this image culture is a weakening of historicity. Lamenting the loss of the grand narratives of modernity, which he believes once made possible the political actions of individuals representing the interests of social classes, Jameson argues that it no longer seems possible to represent the real interests of a people or a class against the ultimate ground of social and economic determinations. Now, there's a lot in this quote to unpack, but I just want to focus on here this notion of the loss of the grand narratives of modernity. Now, some of this question of the loss of the grand narratives of modernity is this sense of myths or collective beliefs or stories, narratives that make social space and history intelligible. Right, so modernist myths of nationhood, right, of building a nation, of a collective project, of a people, perhaps questions of religion, questions of other belief systems that organize our lives, that make our lives representable to one another and to ourselves, and really effectively lend them meaning or some kind of coherent meaning. Now, we could say that postmodernism has many different sort of historical determinations, some of which, but not limited to, on various technological, social, and historical ways are, for example, the rise of neoliberalism in the 1970s and early 1980s, the collapse of international class struggle, which is just to say third worldism, Marxism, and anti-colonial struggles throughout the 1960s and 1970s, the consolidation of television, which is to say images in every household in America, for example, and the rise of video. Also politically, Cold War politics and the question of the nuclear bomb. Also at this time, the notion of globalization, as it was called, was emerging in the discourse. On the more progressive side, at the same time, we had things like second wave feminism, gay rights and activism, an emerging politics of queerness, and environmentalism, as it was called then, also taking their spots on the social stage and determining the ways that the image and image politics were coming to be understood. Now, postmodernism, very quickly, again, to quote Jameson, is a kind of logic of consumer capitalism in which history, or a kind of historical referent, has become mere image, an image like any other. So advertising and history, for example, seem to become blurred. In this kind of social and historical condition, according to Jameson, we lose the ability to map what he calls the totality of social relations. We lose the ability to understand the world, as it were, in its entirety, and to make it intelligible, and to make it a space in which we are able to produce effective actions. Right? And we can already start to see how this raises problems for the documentary, which, at least as it was classically understood, purported to produce the possibility of effective actions in the real world. Now, some of the aesthetic features of postmodernism or postmodern art and architecture are things like fragmentation, pastiche, which is to say imitation, nostalgia, historical depthlessness, rampant quotation, irony, skepticism, and so forth. Linda Williams goes on in her book to cite the theorist and historian Anton Keyes, who has written about post-war Germany and its relationship to the image, and she extrapolates from this to make a broader claim about postmodernism. Here is Keyes, quote, "The sheer mass of historical images transmitted by today's media weakens the link between public memory and personal experience. The past is in danger of becoming a rapidly expanding collection of images, easily retrievable, but isolated from time and space, available in an eternal present by pushing a button on the remote control. History thus returns forever as film." Now, I can't help but be reminded here of the great French theorist and filmmaker Guy Debord, who in the late 1960s described what he called the society of the spectacle. And he makes the important point, that this notion of the spectacle, which anticipates this notion of postmodernism, is not simply a collection of images, but is a relationship between people mediated by images. So shifting from our discussion of the postmodern image and the spectacle to the documentary specifically, we can ask about how it accessed or accesses social reality and history. What formal devices and systems of aesthetics, for example, did it or does it deploy to depict and to say something about the world? For our purposes here, the so-called classical documentary will cover a broad range of films, from roughly the 1920s through the late 1960s and perhaps the early 1970s. And while these films vary greatly in terms of subjects, nationality, ideology, and so on, we could argue that what they all share in common, these classical documentaries, is some commitment to documenting, as it were, a world out there, and that the filmic image was conceived of as a powerful means of doing so. And if it could represent the world out there, then the image could also be used to educate, to inform, and to perhaps even produce effective social change in the social historical world. One of the key features of early documentary from its very origins is the notion of reenactment. Now, the great Scottish theorist and documentary organizer John Grierson in 1933 described documentary as what he called the creative treatment of actuality, which he said is, quote, "a new art with no such background in the story and the stage as the studio product so glibly possesses." So Grierson here is trying to differentiate the documentary project and aesthetics from the theatrical fiction film, as well as the older models of theatrical stage plays, etc. So this sort of modernity of the documentary is very important to Grierson, alongside its social and historical project. One of the films that can't help but be mentioned when one thinks of the classical documentary, especially in relationship to reenactment, is of course Robert Flaherty's 1922 film, The Nook of the North. For example, it is in this much discussed scene in the film, the famous seal hunt, was in fact staged for the camera, although the film does not exactly make this clear to viewers at the time. But Flaherty wanted to work with his Inuit subjects to represent a sort of mythical condition of these people surviving in the Arctic climate. Now, we will be thinking more about the notion of reenactment next week in our lecture on performance and reenactment, and we will take up, for example, its ongoing relevance in the work of filmmakers like Errol Morris and his film, his very important film, 1988's The Thin Blue Line, which we'll be sure to watch some clips from to prepare us to see Joshua Oppenheimer's film, The Act of Killing. But very quickly, The Thin Blue Line is one of the films that Williams focuses on as a kind of film that responds to this postmodern condition of the image, the ubiquity of the image, and depthlessness, in order to produce a kind of what she sees as a kind of post-cinema verite, post-observational cinema that tries to address history in new and complicated ways. One of the other major features of the classical documentary is exposition. Bill Nichols, one of the great theorists and historians of the documentary, has written that images in exposition are used to, quote, illustrate, illuminate, evoke, or act in counterpoint to what is said. We take our cue from the commentary and understand the images as evidence or demonstration. So, in this sense, this is where we get this notion of the voice of God, which is purports to be, can be described as objective, informative, educative, professional, in some ways detached, but also determining in its meanings and its control, as in a sense, over the image. Let us take a look now at one of the famous examples of an expository documentary or expository narration in the 1935 film Housing Problems, the British film directed by Edgar Anstey and Arthur Elton.
A great deal these days is written about the slums. This film is going to introduce you to some of the people really concerned. First, Councillor Lauder, chairman of the Stepney Housing Committee, will tell you something of the problem of slum clearance.
The problem of the slum faces us because in the early days, rows upon rows of ugly, badly designed houses were hastily put up to provide accommodation for the ever-increasing army of workers which poured in from the country to the towns. Here are some pictures of typical slum architecture. This roof is sagging because the rafters have decayed. No amount of new tiles will put it right. When these houses were erected, anyone could build a factory right outside your front door. Many of the houses are so old that they have to be shored up to prevent them falling down altogether. Sometimes the mortar falls away from the brick and the walls bulge out. Here are examples of sheer neglect. These walls probably haven't been attended to since before the war, and the woodwork has gone unpainted for generations. Many houses have not got water laid on. People have to manage as well as they can with a tap in the yard, and sometimes at the end of the street. Few houses have provision for the drying of washing, and the clean clothes have to be hung up in the narrowest of backyards. When it's wet, the clothes have to be dried in the passage. Here's a typical interior of a decayed house. And here the lath and plaster have given away altogether. This lavatory and sink has to do for 4 families.
Another one of the major features of the classical or the late classical documentary is, of course, observation, which the observational handheld camera, which has, in the post-1960s world, took shape in France, Canada, the United States, among other places, in various movements called cinema verite in France and sometimes in the United States, as well as cinema direct in Quebec, and what was also called direct cinema in the United States. As Williams describes it, the observational camera purports to, quote, capture images of an unfolding present real, which is to say, Verite's commitment to film it as it happens. This it, of course, being the activity, the events, the drama of the real world itself unfolding in an unscripted way before the camera. So let's take a look at one of the classic examples of observational documentary, which is a 1960 film entitled Primary, about the political campaign of John F. Kennedy, directed by Robert Drew. You will notice, just as I will quickly note, that there is voiceover at the very beginning of the scene, and then that quickly leaves, and the image itself becomes, as it were, determinant in its meaning. So we no longer rely on voiceover, and we have the image itself showing us it as it happens.
This is the heart of Senator Kennedy's strength, the heavily populated city areas, particularly the Polish Catholic 4th District in Milwaukee.
It is precisely to this type of form and aesthetic, this observational aesthetic, that became dominant in the United States in the 1960s and 1970s, that Errol Morris, in the previously shown clip in the interview, is responding and reacting when he calls for an obtrusive camera, right? A camera that is very present, that is acknowledged by both the subjects being depicted as well as the filmmaker doing the doing the filming. And so this different relationship, this acknowledgement of the presence of the camera. It is also this, as it were, verite aesthetic that Linda Williams is responding to in her essay Mirrors Without Memories. As she writes on page 15, history, in Frederick Jameson's sense of traces of the past, of an absent cause which hurts, would seem, almost by definition, to be inaccessible to the verite documentary form, aimed at capturing action in its unfolding. The recourse to talking heads, interviews, to people remembering the past, whether the collective history of a nation or a city, the personal history of individuals, or the criminal event, which crucially determines the present, is, in these, what she calls verite documentaries, an attempt to overturn this observational commitment to realistically record life as it is, in favor of a deeper investigation of how it became as it is. So, Linda Williams is seeing films like The Thin Blue Line and even Sherman's March, as we'll see, as this kind of, in part, a response to the emphasis on the present, of recording the present in observational documentary. Now, of course, we'll see it can get quite complicated in this regard.